I don't think it comes as a surprise to say that the character of Spider-Man has always resonated with readers. With his relatable issues and great supporting cast, Spidey has endured as one of the greatest pop culture icons of the last half-decade. But in the last few years, the character has really exploded in popularity across all mediums. Tom Holland's version of the character has cemented himself as an MCU mainstay, on par with the likes of Captain America or Iron Man. Insomniac's recent game was a love letter to not just the character, but his world and those who inhabit it. 2 Spider-Man cartoons have landed on Disney XD, with both becoming staples of the network. Spectacular Spider-Man has achieved cult status among Spidey fans in the last few years, rightfully so considering the care and respect it shows the character. We've seen some really great stories from him in the comics lately, like the fascinating deconstruction of Superior Spider-Man, or the heartfelt tribute of 2019's Spider-Man Life Story. The Amazing Spider-Man films, once reviled for being a betrayal of the character, now finds itself defended by extremely passionate fans. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was a heartfelt love letter to every era and depiction of the character. And of course, there's the iconic Raimi trilogy. These films have caught a massive second wind recently, thanks not only to people memeing them to great effect, but because of the countless video essays I've seen by people raised with this take on the wall crawler. But among all this webhead fever, I've noticed that one depiction of the character has gone unsung. A version of Spider-Man that was a mainstay of his universe, like Tom. A version of Spidey whose show was a staple of its network, like Ultimate or 2017. A Spider-Man that had the passionate fanbase of the Amazing Spider-Man films, that had Spidey PS4 and Spidey's respect for the characters. A Spider-Man that had the sense of growth from the comics, Spider-Verse's love for all things wallcrawler, and the massive impact and legacy on fans of the Raimi trilogy. To preface, I need to admit that I hold a massive bias towards this show. I watched reruns of it on Jetix religiously growing up, and this show, alongside the Raimi trilogy, Spectacular, and the criminally underrated Spider-Man Unlimited, were my introductions to this character. This show always has and always will hold a special place in my heart, and that's something that will always at least partially color my view of it. But despite this, I do think I'm still capable of looking at this show from an objective perspective, and I still believe that it's the best depiction of the wallcrawler. It manages to faithfully adapt countless stories from the comics without being beholden to them. Its animation and art style suits the character and his world perfectly. The show has brilliant writing, and the depiction of these characters is the best they've ever been in any medium. Spider-Man the Animated Series is the 4th show in the Marvel Animated Universe, first airing on Fox Kids November 19, 1994, and concluding January 31, 1998. The show is produced by Stan Lee, Bob Richardson, and Avi Arad. The show is animated by TMS Entertainment, best known for their work on Akira, Lupin III, and the early DC Animated Universe. Aerosmith guitarist Joe Perry provided the show's main theme, with lyrics written by Shikai Levy, best known for Go-Go Power Rangers, with a reference to this made in the show's first season, while Saban Entertainment provided the rest of the show's music. The show was a massive critical success for Fox on par with X-Men, with the show earning the network nominations for 2 Daytime Emmys, an Annie Award, and the NAACP's Image Award. In addition, the show spawned off into various pieces of multimedia, including 3 tie-in comics, 2 video games, and countless toys. But what really makes this show so special to me and so many others is its unique presentation, perfect tone balancing, the depth of the characters and their writings, vicious storytelling, and treatment of the source material. One of the most common complaints lobbed against the show today is of its supposedly poor animation. And to be fair, there's some merit to this. The show is notorious for its odd animation, not just the absurd amount of reused footage, often spliced together with no regard for storytelling, but also stiff character movement and grammatical issues for text. But despite this, I feel like a lot of the people who make these claims don't give the show the credit it deserves for how ambitious its animation was. More specifically, I'm referring to the show's use of both CG and traditional cel animation. Marvel originally wanted completely CG backgrounds for the show, but a combination of budgetary limits and limited technology during the 90s made that an impossibility. As a result, they settled on traditional cell animation for most of the show, with the CG used for Peter swinging throughout New York only. In fact, the show's crew actually did extensive research on New York City's geography in the mid to late 90s in order to make the city look as authentic as possible. And though the animation itself is objectively dated, their effort actually pays off in ways that no one really talks about. New York feels like a character unto itself in this show, no less developed than Peter or MJ. Everything from the bustling city streets to the simple parks and churches ooze with life and color. Besides being pretty to look at, this allows viewers to become connected with the city on an emotional level and build an affection for it. This helps because it means viewers are as invested in its safety as Spider-Man is. It also helps that we get to see Peter visit every nook and cranny of the city, from the sewers and docks to smaller neighborhoods. The fact that these areas get just as much detail as the main city of Manhattan itself only adds to the show. And this is only aided by the show's art style. This is what supervising producer Bob Richardson had to say during an interview with Comic Scene magazine. "We wanted Spider-Man to have a contemporary live-action feel that's more NYPD Blue than the Smurfs. In the comics, it's always been very evident that New York City is where the story takes place, so we're making that evident too." Considering how saturated the superhero cartoon market was throughout the 90s, making sure each and every show had a distinct visual language was important, not only to avoid confusing young viewers, but in order to best represent the unique style of the characters and stories being told. For example, Batman the Animated Series took inspiration from film noir and Art Deco to accentuate the show's maturity and timelessness, and this is something that the MAU definitely exceeds at. X-Men looks nothing like Silver Surfer, which looks nothing like United They Stand, and all three of those shows look nothing like any other 90s cape show or even modern superhero cartoons, and Spider-Man's no different in that regard. This show mixes the early 90s intricately gothic backgrounds that Todd McFarlane pioneered with the kinetic action and stylish, almost supermodel-esque characters of John Romita Sr., all while imbuing the show with both its own unique touches and tropes common among cape cartoons during the decade. In the former case, the seamless blend of cutting-edge tech mixed with the likes of 90s disk drives, saturated color palette, and detailed interior shots really help the show stand out today, while the latter sees character designs translated from the comics perfectly. All these elements combined allow for some truly gorgeous moments. An issue I've begun to notice more and more within Spider-Man media recently is tone, and how it's severely suffered in recent years. More specifically, how the quippy, lighthearted elements of the characters are overemphasized to a point that it drastically undercuts any emotional, heartfelt moments. Ultimate Spider-Man normally comes to mind for me. A lot of people who dislike the show feel this way because of its humor, and that's fair, but my problem with Ultimate isn't that it has that kind of zany, off-the-wall humor that's been so common in many post-Teen Titans Go shows. There's a place for that kind of humor, and I actually think the show handles it a lot better than most others. But my issue with Ultimate Spider-Man, rather, is that kind of humor, aside from bringing each and every episode's pacing to a pretty screeching halt, is how it impacts the show's tone. The way I see it, the same way X-Men is the ultimate soap opera of comics, Spider-Man is the ultimate coming-of-age story. The best pieces of Spidey media focus on Peter's growth, not just as a hero, but as a character. And while most coming-of-age stories, and my favorite coming-of-age stories, have a lot of fun and funny moments, they also know that their core is built on very heartfelt, occasionally somber moments. So when an episode of Ultimate is chock full of goofy antics like these,
huh? Even I don't get this one.
it makes moments like this feel fake.
I know you're not nothing. It took strength and courage to wear that amulet and keep that cat power in check all those years. That probably makes you the strongest person I've ever met. Amulet or not, you're still you. And you always have a plan.
This issue doesn't stop with Ultimate Spider-Man, though. I honestly think this has been a problem with the character spanning as far back as Bendis writing him in New Avengers, and has only gotten worse in recent years. Take Astonishing Spider-Man and Wolverine, for example, an almost perfect comic ruined by Peter's portrayal and dialogue. Adam Kubert's art is incredible, the concept of the story is a lot of fun, And seeing these two heroes butt heads is great. The only problem with this story is Peter. He's portrayed as this immature, irresponsible, and borderline vapid pop culture reference machine straight out of the CW. For so much of the story that his emotional moments just fall flat. This is a trap that Spider-Man the Animated Series never really falls into. Spider-Man always has and always will have lighthearted elements to him, which the show knows. The show is acutely aware of the fact that it's not just based on something as inherently out there as a comic book, but one as wild and varied in history as Spider-Man. The writers revel in this fact, and they put in plenty of humorous moments. Obviously, there's a scene with Spider-Man and Shocker in the black suit.
Not quite.
A double cross? Big surprise.
If you think that's a surprise, then you're in for a real shock.
And I'm gonna tear you limb from limb.
Get back here, Shocker! Shocker! You can't escape me! I'll chase you to the ends of the earth!
And you're the main course.
You'll pay for this. The check's in the mail, baby.
In fact, this show is actually unintentional comic gold in a lot of moments. Here are some highlights.
Look! Spider-Man really is the thief.
Oh, great. Jameson will probably be selling Spider-Man really is the thief t-shirts by noon tomorrow.
That's no way to treat a lady, pal.
You sure showed him.
Shut up, you puny little geek.
J. Jonah Jameson, my new business rival. What can I do for you?
Fisk! Peter Parker's like a son to me. I've been planning his wedding for weeks. It was going to be a surprise. I've already hired the top florist in Manhattan.
I'm having roses imported from Ecuador on my private jet.
Unbelievable.
What about the cake? I know the top pastry chef in Queens.
And I know the Queen's top pastry chef.
Yeah, the networks are laughing at me, Brock. Even Fox. Can you imagine the humiliation? And it's all because of you.
Me? Don't blame me. Blame Spider-Man.
I do. But him, I can't fire.
Boss, come on. You don't mean.
Yeah, I do. Through. Finito. Out the door. And get off my Ming vase.
I think he looks good in the mask.
What are you doing? I'm a journalist.
You're also trespassing.
Trespassing? That's ridiculous. Here's my press badge.
I don't see no stinking badge.
Peter Parker's here. Now the party can really begin. I'm so glad you could make it. Put her there.
Osborn's never been this friendly to me before. His grip, it's getting tighter. He'd break my hand if not for my spider strength.
Think you can take pictures of something other than Spider-Man for a change? Parker, your mouth's open.
Enough! It's payback time.
Payback? For what? You did it all to yourself.
Yes, that's what my psychiatrist said. But you know what? His sessions never made me feel this good.
But as funny as this show is, and it's a really funny show, it knows that the quips and memes shouldn't take away from the emotional moments, of which there are plenty in the show.
Mary Jane! No!
It's too late. I'm falling apart too.
We'll get help. Warren! Warren, where the blazes are you?
Forget it, Tiger. He's gone. Oh, dear. Before I go, I want you to know just one thing. If any part of me is anything like the real Mary Jane Watson, she loves Peter Parker more than anything in the world. More than anything.
No! Mary Jane! Mary Jane!
Each and every one of these moments land for me, not just because of the show's outstanding writing or compelling characters, but because of the tone. The cast and the crew understand the importance of these moments for the characters, so we understand it as well. They respect the stories they are telling in the world that they're creating, so the viewers respect it too. This provides a great segue to something else I love about the show, its writing. The show had a really talented crew, with notable names being comics writers like Len Wein, Jerry Conway, and Marv Wolfman. But there's one particular writer I want to focus on right now, John Semper Jr., who also served as the show's story editor. Something that I love about not just Spider-Man, but the entire MAU, is the way they approach adapting storylines from the comics. In that same interview with Comic Scene, Semper had this to say about the crew's philosophy of adapting stories to the big screen. "I wanted to do a story that took all of the comic book's elements, scrambled them up and kept it relatively the same, but different. You can see this approach in all of the show's adaptations of comics. Let's look at my two favorite episodes of the show, Attack of the Octobot and Make-A-Wish, for an example. They're based on Amazing Spider-Man 55 and 56 and 248. The latter story, The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man, sees Peter meeting a young fan of his and reminiscing on his time spent crime fighting, while the former, Doc Ock Wins and Disaster, sees an amnesiac Spider-Man team up with Doc Ock before regaining his memories. While both are good in their own right, they don't really fit together as a cohesive story. The Ock stories pick up plot threads from earlier issues of Amazing, where an attack from Doc Ock caused Aunt May to faint and enter the hospital, with the main two seeing an enraged Spider-Man holding on to his morals despite what Ock's done to him. On the other hand, 248 isn't really about Peter fighting crime, but rather about him reaching out to a fan of his. And the show's writers understood these two stories, and they understood that they don't fit together, so they did exactly what Semper did. They took those comic book elements, as these episodes are obviously based on the two comics, and are fairly straight adaptations of both. They scrambled it up. The show does make some changes to both stories by taking away some superfluous elements, like the Aunt May backstory from 55 and 56, keeping the essential elements of both stories, like an amnesiac Peter teaming up with Otto, and Spider-Man meeting a young fan. They made this story very different from the original comics. Obviously, this show adds a lot of its own elements to the story, some of which are minor and others are major. The biggest one is changing the gender of the kid Peter meets, which in my opinion wasn't really a big aspect of the original story. They're both used to show Peter's growth as a character. Something that I don't think gets enough credit for these episodes is Taina herself. There's obviously that ending, which is really emotional and just beautifully written and directed, but her portrayal in the episode is also great. Stephanie Eustace does a really great job portraying her youthful optimism and adoration for Spider-Man without her coming off as an annoying fangirl rather. How she's used in the story is also something I love. These episodes are definitely the Spider-Man No More portion of the show, with Peter really questioning his role as Spider-Man after his lashing out during a fight with Doc Ock destroys a really important medical lab. The fact that there's an organic in-story reason for him lashing out, Doc Ock putting MJ in danger, is just another great detail. Madam Web, who I think was perfectly introduced into the show here, setting up the Secret Wars and Spider Wars organically without breaking the show's pace, has Peter meet Taina as a way to keep him centered for his upcoming trials. But what I really like is that she doesn't force this. She doesn't make them become friends. Taina and Peter truly bond together, which makes that final moment at the end of Attack of the Octobot hit home even harder. And I also like how they tied Peter's origin in these flashbacks to the Neogenics arc from season 2, and then they kept this story the same, because despite all these changes, the emotional core of both comics is still intact, and I'd argue even stronger here by combining the two, making this the best version of this story. Another great thing about this show is how it approaches crossovers with the larger Marvel universe. One of my problems with MCU Spider-Man is that so much of his character is fundamentally rooted in that universe. So, for example, Captain America, Thor, the Guardians of the Galaxy, all their films are obviously set in the MCU, are distinctly tied to the MCU. Characters and those emotional moments would work well if they took place in a standalone universe, but that's not really the case for MCU Peter. This has less to do with the Iron Boy Jr. meme, which is a topic for another video, but more so how every plot thread in Homecoming, for example, is so fundamentally tied into the Avengers films. In Spider-Man the Animated Series, Peter does cross over with a lot of other Marvel characters, from the X-Men and Iron Man to Daredevil and Captain America, and it's really great to see them together. But what makes those stories work is that they aren't built on the novelty of the team up. That's just the icing on the cake that is Peter's growth in those stories and how those stories relate to Peter. By keeping the focus on Peter, viewers never feel like the story is pointless or some kind of gimmick. And the best part is every story that the show adapts is done this way. From the wedding of Spider-Man and MJ to Secret Wars and the episodes adapting Sinister Six comics, the writers are able to really perfectly take the essential elements of those classic Spidey tales and perfectly refine them for the TV format without losing their emotional core. I think most Spidey fans can agree that the best Spider-Man stories hinge on the characters, their growth, and relationships with one another. I'm definitely one of those people, and I can safely say that this show absolutely nails this aspect. Most of the characters have the traits you'd expect of them. Aunt May is a warm and loving mother figure to Peter, Robbie Robertson is one of Spider-Man's few supporters, Carnage is a violent psychopath, and so on and so forth. But there are a few characters who I want to focus on who I don't think get enough attention. Felicia Hardy, particularly before she becomes Black Cat, is a great foil for Peter. Both lost their father figures early on in their lives, and as a result were very heavily influenced by their mothers. The difference is that Peter's humble upbringing with May made him very empathetic and kind, while Felicia's money and the excess of her life made her a vain party girl. Eddie Brock in the show is actually pretty underrated too. I personally prefer his portrayal in Spectacular, but I think there's a lot of good in him here. Like in the Raimi trilogy, Eddie is a mirror image of Peter, used to emphasize Spider-Man's virtues while highlighting his own vices. But we also get some hints towards Eddie's background, hints that imply that there's more to him than we've seen.
I wanted to be a warrior, fighting injustice, fighting for the innocent people. I guess that's why I became a journalist.
I also think his arc of struggling to control the symbiote is pretty powerful, and has a satisfyingly tragic end in Spider-Man Unlimited. A really underrated character in the show, though, is J. Jonah Jameson, who I would argue is even better than his Raimi counterpart, but I think there's reason to feel this way. For one, he's every bit as memeable as J.K. Simmons is.
Your security staff is incompetent and rude, too.
They just have a low tolerance for yellow journalism.
Yellow? How dare you use that kind of language in description of me?
But more than that, he has a lot of depth to him. Obviously, the character is best known for ragging on Spider-Man, which is great not only for comedy, but also effective in showing the stress that being Spider-Man puts on Peter. But I don't think any version of the character has ever been given a reason as to why they dislike the wall crawler so much. This is something that I think has a lot of potential for great stories, and I don't think it's never really been explored, which is why Asner's version of the character stands out so much. His wife was killed by a masked man after he refused to back down from a story, and since then has held some resentment towards masked figures. I personally really love this addition to the character. Not only is this just a great reason as to why he'd be so opposed to Spider-Man, but I also love how it shows his commitment to his journalism. And there's also little details of the character I love, like how he would never knowingly publish a story with false information about Spider-Man as much as he dislikes him, and the fact that he actually fires Eddie Brock early in the first season for lying to him. And of course, there's this version of Spider-Man himself. One thing that the entire Marvel animated universe was great at was ripping these characters straight from the comic books, while at the same time making them very distinct from every other version of the character before and after them. And I don't think there's a single MAU character who personifies this better than Peter. Like most versions of the character, Peter is a really conflicted person. He often spends a lot of time questioning his choice to be a hero, and reflecting on how that impacts his personal life. The rest of notable Spider-Man traits, like his intelligence and his sense of honor, are all present and accounted for, but at the same time, he's not a rehash of any previous Spider-Man. He's very unique in his own way. For one thing, this version of Spider-Man is funny. Obviously, that's something we would expect of Spider-Man himself, but more so, I mean that Peter Parker in this show is funny. In fact, I would argue that his funniest moments are when he's out of costume.
A riddle, Mr. Parker. What do I have in common with Spider-Man?
You both look good in skin-tight outfits?
My blind date! I completely forgot! Oh, why not just let Smythe's bugs eat me?
But she'll be here any minute. That's her. Go answer the door, Peter.
Don't I get a last meal?
Pit, you ungrateful upstart! I took you in when you were just a kid off the street! I sweated blood teaching you the news business, and for all my troubles you do this to me? You can't quit. You wanna know why? Because you're fired!
JJ, I'll never forget you, no matter how hard I try.
And I think this really brings us into Peter's arc throughout the show, which in my opinion is definitely the best character arc any version of Spider-Man has had. During an interview with Marvel Animation Age for the show's 10th anniversary, Semper had this to say about the show's ending. More specifically, that Stan Lee cameo, which in my opinion is the best Stan Lee cameo, at least until Spider-Man 3 came around. When Peter Parker faces his creator Stan and finally says, "I like myself," then his story is complete. He's gone beyond his creator. He's now his own creation. A lot of people think I threw Stan in there as a cheap gimmick, but the bigger, more cosmic issue is overlooked. Here's a guy facing his creator, in essence his deity, and saying, "Guess what? I'm beyond what you created with all my flaws and problems. I faced a challenge you set out for me, and I've progressed beyond it, and I really like myself. And we can see this built up throughout the show. We finally see Peter accept his role as Spider-Man and everything that comes with it, something that not many other versions of the character really get to do. But more importantly, we get to see Peter wrest some control back into his life. He spent so much of the show controlled by his guilt, the pressure of his responsibilities. To see him overcome all of that and finally influence his own life is so moving. And I think that's why when we get into Unlimited, for all the criticism of the show, I think the fact that we get to see such a confident Spider-Man is so tied into this show's ending. Spider-Man the Animated Series is not a perfect show. The animation doesn't hold up very well. Their reused footage is really jarring. So even as a child, I could just see Avi Arad's fingerprints all over this show.
I'm in the driver's seat, Spider-Man! Smite in his battle chip! Remember, always wear your seatbelt. Too much for you? Spider-Man's no match for my Spider Slayer! No thanks, I already showered today. I'll bet the guys really flip over you. Excuse me while I get myself out of a pinch.
Web Shooting Spider-Man figures and vehicles sold separately.
But that's what I love the most about this show. It knew what its flaws were, and it worked around them as best as it could. But more importantly, the show focused its efforts on what it could control and what it could make as good as possible, its storytelling. And I think more and more people are starting to realize how great this show is. The TAS meme community is going on pretty strong. I heard news of a continuation comic for the show, and even Semper recently shared his idea of how the show would have concluded. So for those who think I'm just blinded by nostalgia, or for those who just haven't seen the show, I'd tell them to pull the show up on Disney Plus and give it a try.
Well, Madam Web, where to now?
Face front, true believer. It has been a long, hard journey. And I think you are finally entitled to some happiness.
Amen to that, dear lady. Amen to that.